In this episode, I want to read with you directly Deuteronomy chapter 9 verse 4, together with Calvin's commentary on this verse, which is both sharp and deeply honest. We are not going to explain first, not summarize first, and not move to application yet. We will first let the scripture speak for itself, and let this interpreter say in full what touches the very place in the human heart that we least want exposed. So let us begin by reading the text. Deuteronomy 9:4. After the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say in your heart, the Lord has brought me in to possess this land because of my righteousness, whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Now let us read Calvin's commentary. Please notice that from the very beginning, he is not dealing with outward behavior, nor with spoken boasting, but with that sentence in the heart that has not yet been spoken aloud. Calvin writes on the words, "Do not say in your heart." Here he more clearly warns the people not to exalt themselves in proud and foolish self-confidence. If their nature were not so corrupt and so malignant, it would have been enough simply to point out God's grace with a single word. But unless their pride is first corrected and destroyed, he cannot lead them into gratitude. Therefore, he removes this stumbling block first, so that God's generosity may appear clearly among them. To say in one's heart is the same as inward reflection and forming a settled opinion. Therefore, Moses rebukes not only verbal boasting, but also that hidden pride which lies concealed within the heart. For once a person transfers to himself the glory that belongs to God, he is inevitably puffed up with arrogance. Moreover, Moses does not merely forbid them from attributing the defeat of their enemies and the possession of the land to their own valor, but also from thinking in their hearts that these things were a deserved reward for their merits. For when a person sets his own righteousness against the generosity of God, the injury done to God's glory is no less than when someone openly boasts that all his blessings were obtained by his own labor. To make this point clearer, I will repeat it again. Moses does not forbid the people from thinking that they obtained the land without God's help. On the contrary, he assumes that they themselves would confess that they prevailed only through God's assistance. But if they do not at the same time acknowledge that they were altogether unworthy, and therefore confess that all of this came from God's gratuitous and unconditional gift, he is not satisfied with such partial gratitude. As for the reason given in the second clause, namely, that the nations were driven out because of their own wickedness, it may appear at first sight to be somewhat weak. For it might be argued that God could have taken what he had taken from these wicked and rejected people and transferred it to those who were more deserving. But this is actually an indirect warning, intended to compel Israel to compare themselves with these nations. For from this they ought clearly to infer that the land of the foreigners, the land from which the original inhabitants were expelled, was not obtained because of their own righteousness. This point will be expressed even more clearly in the following two verses. Here we will pause, because this passage has not yet begun to explain us, but it has already begun to speak to us. Now that we have read this portion of Calvin's commentary, we need to go one step further and clarify one thing. What exactly is he doing here? He is not supplementing historical background, nor is he developing abstract theological theory. He is intensely focused on a single verse of Scripture. What he is explaining is Deuteronomy chapter 9 verse 4. That sentence is short, but extremely precise. Do not say in your heart. Almost the entire commentary revolves around this one phrase, because Calvin sees very clearly that what Moses is really addressing is not the outcome of the war, nor the distribution of the land, but how a person explains everything inwardly once they have already received it. And that is precisely the misunderstanding Moses is correcting. This misunderstanding is not crude unbelief. It is not the statement, "This has nothing to do with God." Rather, it is something far more subtle and far more common. I know God helped me, but I really did deserve it. Calvin is very sharp here. He points out that Moses is not merely forbidding the people from attributing their victory entirely to themselves. In fact, he assumes that Israel will acknowledge that they prevailed through God's help. But here is the problem. That acknowledgement is still not enough. Because a person can thank God while still reserving a sentence in his heart. If I had not worked this hard, if I had not been this upright, if I had not been this disciplined, God would not have treated me this way. This is the very line of thinking Moses intends to dismantle. That is why Calvin repeatedly emphasizes that Moses forbids not only attributing success to one's own ability, but also treating success as a reasonable recompense for one's own righteousness. For when a person sets his own righteousness against God's generosity, it is no different in substance from openly boasting, "I achieved all this by myself." So what is Moses truly calling people to acknowledge? Not merely that God helped me, but something far more uncomfortable, that I did not deserve this at all. Calvin says that unless a person confesses that he has no merit and no qualification, unless he acknowledges that everything comes from God's free and unconditional gift, such gratitude remains incomplete. And when the text says that the nations were driven out because of their wickedness, this is not to place Israel on a moral high ground. It is meant to force them to look back at themselves and realize one thing: you are not standing here because you are better. At this point, we begin to see that many people think pride is something loud, boasting openly, despising others, displaying superiority. But the hardest form of pride to deal with is not that kind. The most dangerous pride is quiet, reasonable, and even appears mature. You would never say, "I don't need God." You would readily admit, "God helped me." And yet, deep down, you still hold on to one conclusion: if I were not this kind of person, things would not have turned out this way. Deuteronomy 9:4 speaks directly to that conclusion. It is not addressing whether you give thanks to God. It is addressing something much deeper: how you understand your right to stand where you stand. Many people think like this: I know it wasn't entirely me, but at least I deserved it. I'm not that bad. I worked harder than others. I didn't go astray, so God treating me this way makes sense. But once you think this way, you have quietly shifted the center of gravity from "God freely gives" back to "I am worthy." And that is precisely the layer Scripture intends to tear down. Because as long as you only acknowledge that God helped me, you can still treat success as a transaction. I worked hard, I stayed upright, I endured, so God responded accordingly. But Scripture does not allow us to stop there. It forces us deeper, to a place where a person must admit, "I am not standing here because I am better." When the text mentions the nations that were driven out, it is not saying you are more righteous than they are. It is saying something far more unsettling. If God had not placed you here, you would have no grounds to argue otherwise. This is not meant to belittle people. It is meant to pull them out of a hidden system of self-protection. Because as long as you believe, "I at least deserve this much," you will never truly understand what grace is. Grace is not "God helps those who try hard." Grace is "God gives to those who do not deserve." And when a person truly admits this, the way he views the world, himself, success and failure, is completely overturned, not into despair but into freedom. Because he no longer needs to spend his life proving that he is worthy. At the end, this entire commentary presses one single question. When you are standing in the land you have gained, after success, after results are already in your hands, what is the sentence your heart is actually saying? Not what you say aloud, but how you interpret everything inwardly. What truly causes people to stumble over Deuteronomy 9:4 has never been the question, "Is God gracious?" But this deeper and far more difficult question: if none of this is because of my righteousness, then what is the meaning of my effort? This is not an excuse. It is a real intellectual and moral obstacle that every thoughtful person eventually encounters. Because we are accustomed to interpreting life as a rational system, effort corresponds to outcome, discipline earns position. At the very least, one deserves recognition. And this is where the confusion lies. We have unknowingly mixed together two things that are fundamentally different. One is effort, the other is righteousness. Effort describes what you do. You invest time, energy, discipline, endurance. You choose not to escape, not to give up, not to take shortcuts. All of this is real, and all of it matters. But righteousness does not describe what you do. It describes the ground on which you stand. Effort describes the process. Righteousness describes status. Righteousness answers the more fundamental question: do you have the right to stand here? Do you have the right to say in your heart, "My being here is reasonable and deserved"? Deuteronomy 9 verse 4 never denies effort. What it denies is a line of reasoning we know all too well, and that is profoundly dangerous. Because I worked hard, therefore I deserve this. That is the line Scripture cuts off. Effort naturally turns into a form of self-credentialing. I worked harder. I wasn't that bad. I held the line. So God treating me this way is only fair. But once you think that way, effort ceases to be effort. It becomes a claim you present before God. And that is the issue of righteousness. Righteousness is not, "I did well enough." It is, "Do I have the right to demand that God treat me this way?" This is why Calvin is so severe. Because he sees clearly that people do not need to deny effort. What they must deny is turning effort into the basis for standing before God. You may work hard, but you may not say, "Because I worked hard, I deserve to be here." Once effort becomes righteousness, life quickly collapses into one of two extremes. Success leads to quiet self-justification. Failure leads to total loss of self-worth, because your value has become bound to performance. This is where I myself most easily stumble and fail to articulate clearly, because we are so accustomed to explaining everything in terms of worthiness. But Deuteronomy 9 verse 4 refuses to let us live that way. It does not remove responsibility, it dismantles the internal system we use to stabilize ourselves. When effort is returned to its proper place and righteousness is taken out of our hands, everything begins to change. You still work hard, but you no longer use effort to prove yourself. You remain responsible, but you no longer negotiate with God on the basis of responsibility. You begin to live by a different logic. Effort is a response. Righteousness is grace. Effort is human faithfulness, step by step on the ground. Righteousness is God's decision about whether you may stand before Him. That is why Deuteronomy 9 verse 4 matters so deeply. It is not telling people to loosen their grip. It is telling them to stop mixing two things that were never meant to be combined. Not to abandon effort, but to stop using effort as a substitute for righteousness. And if Deuteronomy 9:4 truly lands in us, the first thing it changes is not outward behavior, but the way we speak inwardly after things have already worked out. Because most of the time, we do not drift when life is hardest. We drift after we have made it through, when circumstances stabilize and results are in hand. Let me give a very ordinary example. There is someone who has struggled for years. He took no shortcuts, worked diligently, endured pressure, and held certain boundaries. Eventually, his position stabilized, his income became secure, and life slowly improved. He thanks God. He says this road was not easy. But one day, when he sees someone who has fallen, someone whose life is in chaos, someone who did not endure, a sentence quietly forms in his heart, perhaps never spoken aloud but very real. If you had worked as hard as I did, you wouldn't be here. That sentence is exactly what Deuteronomy 9:4 addresses. The issue is not whether you once worked hard. The issue is how you now explain where you stand. Or take a more hidden example. Someone is very serious about faith. Regular gatherings, scripture reading, prayer, service, careful living. When life runs smoothly, he does not think of himself as proud. But when things begin to fall apart, family, health, relationships, his first reaction is not dependence, but confusion or even indignation. I have lived this way. Why would this happen to me? In that moment, something is exposed. His effort has quietly become the basis for expecting favorable treatment. This is precisely the danger Calvin identifies. People do not deny God. They use their own righteousness to quietly resist God's generosity. The application of Deuteronomy 9:4 is not to stop trying. It is to recalibrate the way we interpret ourselves every time we stand securely. When you begin to think, it makes sense that I am here. I deserve this. You are standing in a very dangerous place. The posture that aligns with this text is a different one. When things go well, instead of stabilizing yourself by saying, I endured, you honestly confess, if God had not decided this, I would have no grounds to demand a different outcome. When you see others fall, instead of distancing yourself by thinking I'm better, you remember, you are not here because you are more righteous. This does not make people passive. It makes them humbler and freer. You still work hard, but you no longer elevate yourself by effort. You remain responsible, but you no longer bargain with God using responsibility. You begin to live in a new way, Not spending every day proving that you are worthy, but remembering every day that you are standing here, not by your own righteousness.